African leaders speak out at the UN General Assembly in New York. Nigeria reaches a milestone in its fight against polio. And it's a new era for one of the most beloved satirical news programs in the U.S., with a young African comic at the helm. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. We begin at the United Nations in New York, where world leaders continue to speak, addressing a wide range of issues, including poverty eradication, reforms within the UN system, and global security and terrorism. Among African leaders who have addressed the UNGA are Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe and Muhammadu Buhari of Nigeria. Mr. Buhari, who was addressing the assembly for the first time, called on the world to pay attention to the threat and devastation being caused by Boko Haram in his country and in the entire West African region.
Boko Haram's war against the people of Nigeria, Chad, Niger, and Cameroon may not attract as much worldwide attention as those in the Middle East, but the suffering is just as great and the human cost is equally high.
While the world has drastically changed since 1945, the United Nations and indeed the global governance architecture remains mired in a long bygone era. This archaic hierarchy among nations threatens to erode the confidence and support that the United Nations commands among the majority, but disadvantaged of its membership.
Well, Mr. Mugabe decried the exclusion of millions of Africans in the decision-making process of the world body. Well, for more on the United Nations General Assembly, VOA's UN correspondent Margaret Bashir joins us live from New York. Margaret, welcome once again. Now, on the sidelines of the UNGA, of course, there's been a lot happening. Tell us about the South Sudan talks around the UN building.
Yeah, busy day here in New York, Vincent. This morning there was a high-level meeting that the Secretary General chaired on South Sudan. He had Riek Machar there, and Salva Kiir joined by a video link from Juba. The Secretary General had some strong words for both the leaders. He said that it's their historical and political responsibility to put South Sudan on a path to peace, and he urged them to implement the peace agreement signed last month without delay. He also urged them not to import arms anymore and to end the suffering of the South Sudanese people. And he said, I hope you will not disappoint us, because the international community has been trying to help you for 4 years. So he was pretty stern with both the leaders.
And rather interesting that actually President Salva Kiir wasn't there in person. The last time he sent Mr. The deputy, who was the deputy president at that time, who is the opposition now, and he did not make it now personally to the UN, right?
Well, interesting, last year Salva Kiir was here in New York and he just didn't show up at the meeting. So that was really sort of an insult to the United Nations, because they've been working so hard for the people of South Sudan, and for the president to snub them that way, it was not seen in a very good light here in New York. But today, Vice President James Iga was here, and so he represented the government at the meeting. But Salva Kiir spoke via the video link.
All right, now, again, there's a very important summit that is taking place today, right there. This is on fighting violent extremism. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right, President Barack Obama chaired a meeting of the Countering ISIL Coalition, and that's a coalition of about 60 countries. And today he announced that Nigeria, Malaysia, and Tunisia would be joining the coalition. He said that more than 24 countries are contributing military capabilities to fighting ISIL, and he said that the other countries who contribute, bring economic, intelligence, and other capacities to the coalition. So last year, President Obama, when he was here, he chaired a meeting of the UN Security Council that adopted a resolution on fighting foreign terrorist fighters, fighting the flows of foreign terrorist fighters, and trying to stem financing to them. This year it was sort of a assessment meeting, I would say, to see where the gaps are and where they need to make improvements. And over 100 countries attended the meeting. There were representatives from civil society and other groups, private sector as well, at this meeting.
You know, President Buhari, Muhammadu Buhari of Nigeria did speak earlier in the bite we used, and they said Boko Haram may not be catching the attention of many in the world. Is that the kind of vibe you get, that Boko Haram is not a big focus of the international community?
Well, I think it is certainly a focus of the United Nations here. But I'll tell you, President Buhari spoke at the Countering ISIL meeting, and he said because Boko Haram wasn't getting the attention they wanted, they joined up, they pledged their allegiance with ISIL, and they did that in March of this year. And he said that he interpreted that as an indication that Boko Haram's operational capacities had been hurt by the Nigerian military and the joint multinational task force of the Lake Chad Basin region by their efforts to stop Boko Haram. So he thought they were, linking themselves with ISIL to get more attention.
Now, Margaret, finally, what can we expect in the remaining part of this day and the coming days?
Well, more speeches today in the General Assembly Hall, and tomorrow there's going to be an important meeting that the Secretary General is chairing on the issue of refugees and migrants going into Europe. So that's going to be the focus of Wednesday's meetings here, the massive refugee crisis that's going on right now.
A great opportunity, too, for leaders who would otherwise never hang out together to be kind of sitting around a table and talking, right?
No, well, they say that the UN Ministerial Week, the Secretary General has over 230 engagements this week, and there's hundreds of bilateral meetings. It's a great opportunity for world leaders to see each other and meet, and as we know, last night, President Obama and Mr. Putin took advantage of that opportunity, and they met for an hour and a half. And for those two leaders, it was their first formal meeting in more than a year.
Indeed, and we're going to talk a little more about that. Thanks a lot, Margaret, for your excellent reporting as usual. Enjoy New York.
Thanks for having me, Vincent.
Well, Margaret Bashir of Voice of America reporting live from the UN in New York. Now, finding the best way to combat terrorism is high on the agenda for many of the world leaders attending the UNGA this week in New York. On Tuesday, U.S. President Barack Obama delivered remarks at the summit on countering ISIS and violent extremism at the UN headquarters.
There are going to be successes and there are going to be setbacks. This is not a conventional battle. This is a long-term campaign, not only against this particular network, but against its ideology.
Well, two of the world's most powerful leaders used the United Nations world stage to offer up starkly contrasting views on the two long simmering areas of conflict, Syria and Ukraine. Those issues dominated the face-to-face meetings between U.S. President Barack Obama and Russian President Vladimir Putin. It was their first such formal meeting in more than 2 years. VOA White House correspondent Aru Panda reports from the UN in New York.
The image seemed to say it all as President Obama and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin headed into more than 90 minutes of talks late Monday. They managed a forced handshake. The meeting came just hours after both leaders offered diverging viewpoints on the Syrian conflict and the leadership of Bashar al-Assad. In his UN General Assembly address, Obama called the Syrian president a tyrant who, quote, drops barrel bombs to massacre innocent children. He urged the world body to unite behind a political transition in Syria that does not include Assad.
The United States is prepared to work with any nation, including Russia and Iran, to resolve the conflict. But we must recognize that there cannot be, after so much bloodshed, so much carnage, a return to the pre-war status quo.
Just 2 hours later, Putin used the same forum to criticize U.S.-led efforts against the Islamic State militant group and justify Russia's expanding military support for Syria and its leader.
We think it is an enormous mistake to refuse to cooperate with the Syrian government and its armed forces. who are violently fighting terrorism face to face. We should finally acknowledge that no one but President Assad's armed forces and Kurds militia are truly fighting the Islamic State.
The two world leaders also sparred on the situation in Ukraine, with President Obama denouncing Russia's annexation of Crimea and continued aggression in the country's east.
We cannot stand by when the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a nation is flagrantly violated. If that happens without consequence in Ukraine, it could happen to any nation gathered here today.
A White House official said Obama repeated those concerns to Putin during Monday's bilateral talks, expressing concern about the implementation of the peace agreement reached in Minsk. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Stephen Pfeiffer.
There's little evidence to suggest that the Russians are doing anything or pushing the separatists to implement other provisions of the Minsk II agreement. And so President Obama has an opportunity to send a strong message.
A White House official described the meeting as businesslike and productive, with both sides disagreeing on Assad's role in Syria while agreeing that their militaries should communicate in order to avoid conflicts in the region. Aru Pandey, VOA News, the United Nations.
Well, Nigeria is celebrating the announcement by the UN Health Agency that polio is no longer endemic in the West African country. The Global Polio Eradication Initiative, the public-private partnership leading the effort to eradicate polio, called this a historic achievement in global health. 20 years ago, Nigeria was recording 1,000 polio cases a year, the highest in the world. Nigeria has not reported a case of wild polio virus since July 24, 2014, and all laboratory data have confirmed a full 12 months have passed without any new cases. As recently as 2012, Nigeria accounted for more than half of all polio cases worldwide. Now, for more insight into how Nigeria did it and what must be done to completely eradicate polio, Dr. Frieden, Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Chairman of the Polio Oversight Board, joins us live via Skype from Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Frieden, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a good day. It's real progress in Nigeria and Africa, but also remaining challenges.
Indeed, Doctor, many are saying, how did Nigeria do it eventually after such a long struggle?
There were many aspects of the success. One was political commitment at every level, including governors of key states. The second was the use of what are called emergency operations centers. These are not just places, but an organizational means of ensuring that we track every task that has to be done and we coordinate among all of the partners who are involved. And then also at CDC, we worked closely with Nigerian doctors and other health workers to do what was called NSTOP, National Stop Transmission of Polio. And we put more than 250 staff in all of the districts, all of the LGAs, the local government areas, where there was continued spread of polio to allow them to rapidly improve immunization services. These were really key. And with these innovations and with hard work on the front lines, it does appear that Nigeria has gotten over the finish line.
Now, Dr. Frieden, you say, well, it's no longer in the list of endemic polio countries. What does that mean, and what do you do to completely eradicate polio in Nigeria?
It will take 2 more years of careful, meticulous tracking to make sure that it's not hiding somewhere in a case here or a case there. I was in Nigeria recently. I was impressed with how good and robust the surveillance system is, but it'll be another 2 years before we know for certain that it's out. And the rest of Africa needs to ramp up surveillance to make sure that there's no polio anywhere in Africa. It does appear that for the first time in human history, Africa may be polio-free, but unless we strengthen surveillance even further, we cannot be certain of that.
Now, very briefly, can the lessons learned in Nigeria be applied in particularly the countries that still report those cases, Pakistan, Afghanistan, for example?
I think there are a couple of big fallouts from this. One, Nigeria now has 2 real successes in the past year. The first is no more endemic polio. The second is using that polio system, that polio infrastructure, to stop the Ebola outbreak in Lagos. It's quite possible that the situation would be very different if the polio system hadn't been available to stop Ebola. And with those two successes, there's now more pressure on Nigeria to do more about malaria, family planning, maternal mortality, HIV, other serious health problems there, as well as, of course, all immunizations and vaccine-preventable diseases. Pakistan and Afghanistan are now the last two countries in the world to have endemic polio, and all eyes are on them to protect children there so that this can be the ultimate for all children everywhere, forever.
Dr. Frieden, such a delight talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Tom Frieden, the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, who joined us from Atlanta, Georgia. Now, the World Health Organization has warned that there is a high risk of polio spreading in Guinea and Mali after a Guinean toddler recently traveled to Mali and became the country's first case of the crippling disease in more than 4 years. A polio vaccination campaign has been launched to stem any polio spread in both countries.
Nigeria has reached a milestone. The World Health Organization has removed the country from the list of polio-endemic countries. The WHO made the announcement recently in New York. This means 2 countries remain endemic, Pakistan and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Mali is on high alert. Authorities have started a mass polio vaccination campaign to avert any cases of a crippling vaccine-derived polio virus that could spread in the country and in neighboring Ebola-ravaged Guinea. The virus was detected after a Guinean toddler traveled to Mali and became the country's first polio case in more than 4 years. In Kuremale, near the Mali-Guinea border, health workers are going from door to door vaccinating all children under 5. Fatoumata Koulibaly is a resident of Kuremale.
I ask all women to vaccinate their children to avoid this disease. Don't refuse or hide your children. Polio makes your child miserable. Your child will stay in the house and will not be able to walk.
The new case recorded in Mali was caused by a strain of the virus known as type 2 that had come from a vaccine. Preliminary tests showed the 19-month-old was paralyzed on July 20th, 7 days before being brought to Mali for treatment. Vaccine-derived polio infections are caused when the virus spreads after being excreted by people who have been immunized with live oral polio vaccine. Unvaccinated children and people with low immunity are then at high risk of becoming infected via contaminated water and sewage.
For Mali, we can say today that we congratulate our health personnel because the case has been identified in Mali, but it didn't come from Mali. That is clear. Because of our system of monitoring and our performance, we were able to control the virus and take immediate action to rapidly stop it from spreading.
And as the world moved closer to its goal of eradicating polio, specialists warn such vaccine-derived cases could jeopardize the progress.
This is an exceptional situation which could happen when the vaccination coverage is low, because in vaccination there is a group immunity. Once we have a high coverage of vaccination, other children will be protected as well. But once the level of vaccination is low, this could put us in a situation like the one we are facing.
Vaccine-derived poliovirus outbreaks are rare, but pose more of a risk in populations where health systems are fragile and immunization coverage is low. Polio is a highly contagious disease that has no cure. It attacks the nervous system and can cause irreversible paralysis within hours of infection. Mass campaigns as well as routine immunizations continue in affected countries to strengthen immunity among various populations.
Well, that was Lino Mudu reporting. Now, the president of Central African Republic, Catherine Samba Panza, left early from the UN General Assembly in New York to return home on Monday due to violence in the capital of our country, in which around 30 people have been killed. Around 30 people have been killed and over 100 more injured in 3 days of intercommunal clashes in Bangui, a city secured by UN and French peacekeepers. The violence has sparked fears that Samba Panza could be overthrown. Thousands of protesters called for the rearming of the sidelined Central African Army after 2 days of violence. Earlier, hundreds of prisoners escaped from the main jail in the capital, and UN peacekeepers fired warning shots to disperse thousands of protesters. In New York, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the UN Security Council condemned that violence there. Well, I want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. And check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Find me on Twitter at VOA Vince Makori. Well, coming up, interview with Namibia's mining and energy minister. Stay with us.
Like Voice of America on Facebook. Follow VOA on Twitter. Join VOA on our YouTube channel. Like, follow, join VOA.
Welcome back. Mining and energy are vital industries for Namibia. Now, despite a sharp drop in commodity prices this year, the 50th largest country in Africa continues to grow. Namibia's Minister of Mining and Energy, Opeth Kajose, recently sat down with VOA's Alexis Christophers to talk about how the country is counteracting the commodities sell-off and attracting foreign investment.
It contributes 13% of GDP. Think from fisheries or just about equal to fisheries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we know that commodities prices have been hit very hard recently. Tell me how that has affected business within Namibia.
Right now, we are just at the very beginning of that cycle down, and we're feeling the prices going down. For the period before that, it really was a boom and still remains a boom. The most affected is diamonds and uranium. Mm-hmm. For the rest of the other commodities, yes, we are experiencing a downturn, but not as much.
And why is that? How have you been able to insulate yourselves when some other African nations have not been able to?
Over the many years, we promote very, very actively the potential, and the investment climate is a top priority for our government. We tour around the world as we woo and lure investors to Namibia. Mm-hmm. Whether it's during low times or high times, we've been ranked #1 in the African continent by the Fraser Institute of Canada. So, and that's as a result of keeping the investors very, very live within our context.
And so have you seen any sort of foreign investment money dry up during this time period, or has it been steadily growing?
It's steadily been growing if I equate that to the last 25 years. Mm-hmm. Our economy has actually structurally and otherwise grown by 15-fold in the last 25 years. Mm. One can only deduce that that incremental effort has borne real fruits for us. Or periodically, like in now, we do suffer or experience the downturns, but overall, the curve has been on the upward trend.
Are you noticing that some of your clients, some of the larger mining companies, are starting to cut back because they need to make strategic decisions in the face of falling commodity prices?
Indeed, that's very true.
How so? How have they been cutting back?
They've been cutting back, especially we experience the retrenchment cycles go down on that one. The investment period would perhaps last over a longer period than it otherwise would, say if it had to happen in 5 years, as companies wait out for the periods and the cycles to come back up to the hails of the market. So that's how companies behave.
Have you been seeing any layoffs because of this?
In the last 6 months, we are just about to experience layoffs. Yes, we've seen, say, up to 3 or 5 layoffs, yes.
And what's the outlook for the mining and energy sector within Namibia in the next, say, 6 months to a year out?
Mining is a backbone, is part of the backbone in our country. Mining remains a very significant contributor to the GDP and the benefits to our country.
Minister of Mines and Energy of Namibia, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you indeed for having me. And
I'm Alexis Christophers, VOA News for Africa 54, New York.
Well, it's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54. Well, it's a new era for satirical news as a South African comedian takes over The Daily Show. We'll be right back.
If you've just joined us, I'm Mariama Diallo, and here is a quick recap of today's headlines. In the Central African Republic, hundreds of prisoners escape a Bangui jail following a third day of violent protests that killed dozens. In Libya, Coast Guard rescues 346 migrants off the coast of Tripoli, adding to the over 1,000 migrants saved in recent rescue missions. In Burkina Faso, the powerful presidential guard refuses to disarm following short-lived coup, despite frequent protests and harsh criticism from the UN and the African Union. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, former vice president pleads not guilty to charges of corrupting witnesses in an attempt to secure his acquittal. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Welcome back to Africa 54. Here's what's trending. Trevor Noah has had a mixed reception from critics as he made his debut hosting The Daily Show, replacing Jon Stewart, who left last month. Now, the 31-year-old South African comedian made a smooth transition into the role on Comedy Central's satirical news show, according to Variety. Deadline called the evening mostly inoffensive, but also mostly flat. Stewart stepped down after 16 years at the helm of the influential show. Noah's appointment was announced in March. Next up, organizers and tattooists are buzzing about Asian artwork at this year's International London Tattoo Convention. The event, now in its 11th year, is drawing dozens of nationalities as attendees take the chance to be tattooed by artists from far-flung places or with otherwise long waiting lists. The event is expected to attract around 20,000 visitors this year. It's grown alongside tattoo culture, which has become more mainstream as footballers and other celebrities are increasingly choosing to get inked. And that is what is trending today. Well, and that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com for more news. Tune in to VOA's evening radio show, Africa News Tonight, at 1800 UTC. And in the mornings today, Break Africa between 0300 and 0800 UTC, Monday through Friday. Thanks a lot for watching from all of us here in Washington. Have a good night.